I'm Tracy Sable. Tonight on EWTN News Nightly, major rulings. The Supreme Court makes decisions on religious freedom and college admissions. We have a report and reaction. Pushing back, how the U.S. bishops are responding to the Catholic Democrats who say their faith allows them to support abortion. Nights of violence, clashes between police and protesters in France. We have the latest. And strength in our weakness, why Pope Francis says we can learn a lot from the two saints whose feast we celebrate today. These stories and more tonight.
From EWTN, the Global Catholic Network, this is EWTN News Nightly.
Thank you for being with us on the Feast of Saints Peter and Paul. Our top story tonight, two major Supreme Court decisions came down today. One protects religious freedom and liberties for those in the workforce, and another rejects the use of race as a factor in college admissions. Capitol Hill correspondent Eric Rosales brings us this report from the Supreme Court.
Good evening, Tracy. First, let's talk about the religious freedom case. The justices voted unanimously in favor of a Christian U.S. postal carrier who refused to deliver Amazon packages on Sunday. He said it was against his religion. The fill-in mail carrier, Jared Groff, who worked in the Amish country in Pennsylvania, said he was told he was going to be fired if he couldn't work on the Sabbath because it resulted in extra work for other employees and worsened morale. Groff eventually left his job over the Sunday shifts, but hoped the lawsuit would mean others wouldn't have to choose between their job and religion. Supporters outside the court praised the justice's decision, saying for the first time it gives people serious about their faith teeth.
We all want to live in a country where you don't have to choose between your faith and your livelihood. If we have to, we'll do it. All right? We know the words of Christ. We know the example. But is that what we want?
Groff's attorney says, quote, the court's decision today restores religious freedom to every American in the workplace. This decision will positively help millions and millions of Americans, those who work now and their children and grandchildren. In the other case, the justices rejected the use of race as a factor in college admissions as a violation of the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. In a 6-3 decision, Chief Justice John Roberts wrote in the majority opinion that, quote, a benefit to a student who overcame racial discrimination, for example, must be tied to that student's courage and determination. The student must be treated based on his or her experiences as an individual, not on the basis of race. Both sides spoke out.
This is a historic victory for Asian Americans because all children will no longer be treated as second-class citizens in college admission.
This decision today sends a message that you can work very hard, and literally colleges and universities are allowed to have certain criteria and set certain limits that then can decide the fate of one's life outside of their own impetus and outside of their own agency. This is a problem.
Tomorrow, we are expected to get a decision from the High Court about whether President Biden and the Department of Education has the ability to forgive nearly $750 billion in student loan debt. I'll stay on top of the issue. Outside the U.S. Supreme Court, Eric Rosales, EWTN News Nightly.
Our reaction to the High Court's decision to strike down affirmative action in college admissions coming in from the White House and those seeking the White House in 2024. White House correspondent Owen Jensen has more. Owen.
Tracy, former Vice President Mike Pence says he is pleased with the ruling, writing in a statement, quote, there is no place for discrimination based on race in the United States. However, President Biden sees it much differently. He said he strongly disagrees with the court's decision.
Reacting to the Supreme Court's ruling, President Joe Biden goes before cameras in the Roosevelt Room.
Today, the court once again walked away from decades of precedent.
The president delivered a speech that was quickly added to his schedule after he learned of the court's decision, saying, we need a higher education system that works for everyone.
Discrimination still exists in America. Today's decision does not change that.
After, the president went to New York to be interviewed by MSNBC and attend more campaign fundraisers. At a campaign event in Chicago yesterday, he once again called for codifying the abortion rulings in Roe v. Wade. But one presidential candidate has a new ad that aims to protect life in the womb. South Carolina Senator Tim Scott, the radio ad's narrator, reminds listeners, helped Roe get tossed.
Scott has a 100% pro-life voting record, and he fought to put 3 new conservative justices on the Supreme Court, sending Roe v. Wade to the ash heap of history.
And in the senator's own words,
as president, I will sign the most pro-life legislation that reaches my desk. Our immediate priority should be passing a national 15-week limit on abortion while we support Republican-led states that do even more to protect life.
The senator's campaign says the ad will be heard on Christian radio in Iowa. In it, he also slammed the current administration.
The Biden liberals support abortion up until the moment of birth. I'm running for president to stop their radical agenda and create a culture of life in America.
Now, back to the High Court's affirmative action decision. Presidential candidate Nikki Haley also happy with it, writing, quote, "Picking winners and losers based on race is fundamentally wrong." And former President Donald Trump wrote, "This is a great day for America. We're going back to all merit-based, and that's the way it should be." At the White House, Owen Jensen, EWTN News Nightly.
And we go now to Mark Rienzi, President and CEO of the Becket Fund for Religious Liberty. Mark, great to be with you today. We have a lot to unpack. But first, let's talk about the case of the Christian postal worker from Pennsylvania and the ruling. Were you at all surprised?
No, I wasn't surprised, and I was happy to see that 9 justices on the court could agree to give religious workers real civil rights protections the way Congress intended them.
Mark, talk to us about the significance of this case and also what comes next.
This is a great example of the court correcting one of its old mistakes. 50 years ago, the justices had given the wrong interpretation to federal civil rights laws. And when they did that, they basically reduced the protection for religious employees who asked for accommodations. Congress had said that most of the time, employers should accommodate their workers' religious lives, which is, the reasonable and right thing to do. The court got that wrong 50 years ago, and today all 9 of them agreed to correct it and to say that most of the time, employers ought to accommodate the religious exercise of their employees, unless it imposes real substantial costs that make it hard to run the business. And that's just not going to be most of the time. So the result is that we're going to get a lot more religious freedom in the country, and a lot more religious workers will have the ability to get their religion accommodated.
Mark, another major ruling today that I want to talk about is the striking down of affirmative action in the college admissions process. Tell us more about this 6-3 decision and what it can mean for colleges going forward.
Well, the Supreme Court said that it's no longer okay for colleges to continue using race as a factor in choosing students for who gets in and who gets left out. And the court specifically talked about how race is being used not only as a positive factor for some, but as a negative factor for others. And the court said that in place of that, colleges should focus on the actual individual student and their own experiences. And it doesn't mean they have to ignore race. Race can be an important part of someone's experience. But the court said that the student has to be judged on his or her own life and record rather than the color of his or her skin. Yeah, and I understand 2 of the justices, Clarence Thomas and Sonia Sotomayor, read a summary of their opinions on the case to the courtroom. What did you make of that move, that is, and is that typical? It is common for justices to read either the majority opinion or a dissent or a concurrence from the bench. It does happen. I actually wasn't in the room when it happened, so I don't know how it went down in the room, but I do know it is something the justices do from time to time when they have a message that they think, they want kind of the world to hear from their own mouth as opposed to just reading it in print. Yeah, and of course, we're still waiting on more decisions coming down. And one we've been watching very closely is 303 Creative. When do you think we can expect to see that decision, and any sense on how the justices may rule on that case? Yeah, I think we'll see it between 10 and 10:10 tomorrow morning. I have pretty high confidence it's coming tomorrow morning. And I think we're going to see a strong win for the website designer. This is actually something that should be a very, very easy free speech case. The government doesn't get to force people to write things that they don't agree with, period, full stop. And when the government of Colorado tried to force that website designer to write websites for same-sex weddings, even though she didn't want to, they violated the Constitution. You can't make people do that. You can't force somebody to write a Trump for president commercial if they don't like Trump for president. Our government just doesn't get to force words out of our mouths or out of our pens. So it's going to be a win for the website designer. It's going to be a win for America and freedom and pluralism, that the government can't force us to do those things. Yeah, and we'll be waiting and watching on that one. Really quickly, we have about 30 seconds left or so, Mark. What other cases are you watching and still waiting to hear about? The one other big one that we can expect to hear about tomorrow is the Biden administration's student loan program and whether the administration has the ability to simply decide on its own and without any legislation from Congress that it's going to forgive some very large, like nearly $1 trillion worth of student loan debt. The question really is about federal power, right? Does the president have the ability to do that without a statute, or would Congress have to authorize that kind of move?
All right, we shall see what happens. Mark Rienzi, President and CEO of the Becket Fund, thank you so much for coming on today.
Thank you, Tracy.
Well, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops is responding to the 31 Catholic congressional Democrats who say their faith does not stop them from supporting abortion. The USCCB calls the claims a grievous distortion of the Catholic faith. In a letter, the church leaders also said in part, quote, "It is wrong and incoherent to claim that the taking of innocent human life at its most vulnerable stage can ever be consistent with the values of supporting the dignity and well-being of those in need." And we have a lot more still to come here on EWTN News Nightly, including crisis at the border. A lawmaker reacts to a new poll that reveals more than half of voters want military troops at the U.S. southern border. Plus, violence rocks France for a third day in a row in the wake of the death of a teenager. We have the latest. Poll by NBC News finds that 55% of voters would like to see U.S. troops at the southern border to stop drug smugglers. And 46% said they would support a presidential candidate who would deploy troops to the border in an effort to deal with the migrant surge. Joining us now is Republican Congressman Pat Fallon of Texas to talk to us more about this. Sir, great to see you today. You are from a border state. You're from Texas, and I know that you've been dealing with a lot lately down there in the Lone Star State. What do you make of this poll, and what do you think about U.S. military troops at the border? I mean, do you think that will make a difference?
Well, we have to do something, and I'm actually kind of surprised that it's as low as it is, because if the American people really knew the truth, I think that figure would probably be closer to 90%, because 10% are simply hopeless not to do what's in the best interest of this country. We had never had a month in our history where we had 200,000 illegal border crossings. Under Joe Biden, we've had 13 months that met or exceeded that threshold. And what Joe Biden's policies have done is made every state a border state. And Americans are endangered and dying by the droves. 75,000 people died of fentanyl poisoning last year alone. Nearly all of that is manufactured in China and then ferried through Mexico. So it's in the United States' best interest to secure our border and to do it immediately.
You know, from your perspective, I mean, what is the biggest issue or challenge right there at the southern border?
It's the will of this administration to secure it, quite frankly. I mean, when you look at, say, for instance, this past month in May, they were crowing about the fact that there were only, quote unquote, only 204,000 illegal border crossings. That's the worst May we've ever had in our history, and they were trying to brag about it. But when you compare it to the last May President Trump was in office, there were 23,000 illegal border crossings. So it's 10 times worse under Joe Biden. So if we have the will and the policies like the Wait in Mexico policy, because we also understand that 99% of the folks that are crossing the border illegally are economic migrants. They're not truly asylum seekers, although that's what this administration is, guiding them and facilitating and, giving them the tools to claim falsely asylum.
Okay, I want to stick to your state of Texas. Last week, you may know this, Fort Worth's website was believed to be hacked by a group known as SiegeSec because of the state's stance on so-called gender-affirming care. This says we are near the end of so-called Pride Month. Representative Fallon, remind us of the bill that Governor Abbott signed into law earlier this month.
Okay. So in Texas, the legislature, of which I had served in for 8 years, did something that I thought was highly responsible in protecting children that said, gender affirming care, if you want to do that, you're going to do that as an adult, because I do believe, as many others feel, that it's child abuse. If you can't, the age of consent, we've agreed long ago, 50 years ago, was 18. And something that irreversible should be done and a decision made by an adult and not a child, because there are, unfortunately, some parents that aren't parenting well.
Yeah, and speaking of parents, something that happened this month as well, I know that you made some comments recently during a hearing that one of your colleagues in Congress took issue with, and then she tweeted it. Let's take a listen.
If I didn't have a father in my home, my father passed away a year ago, I would not be in Congress right now, for sure. Because when you're a 14 or 15-year-old, you're just not afraid of your mom, and it's hard to raise kids, as we all know, raising kids. And that's why it's easier when you have the two-parent home.
All right, I'm raising two teenagers, so yes, it is hard raising kids. Congressman Fallon, why do you think you got so much heat for making a comment about the importance of the nuclear family?
That's just where the left is right now, and it's very sad. I won't use any names, so I'll give you her initials. Katie Porter from California. She just went hard left, and it was a very odd thing for her to say and to be triggered on, because simply what I said was it's difficult to raise children. It's particularly in a single-parent home, and it's easier if you have two parents. I didn't besmirch single-parent homes, because there's some folks, some moms and dads out there that are doing it by themselves that do a fabulous job. It's merely easier, and the statistics bear that out. There's less academic and social and emotional and cognitive problems in two-parent households. And there was a study done in 2015 by New York University that found that you're 3 times more likely to graduate college if you were raised in a two-parent home. And then income levels are twice as high in two-parent homes than they are in single-family homes. So it's not just me, it's reality. And so for Katie Porter and the rest of the liberals to be triggered by reality is very telling.
All right, Congressman Fallon, great to be with you today. Thanks, we appreciate it.
Thank you so much. God bless.
Up next on EWTN News Nightly, resisting temptation. Muslim pilgrims perform a sacred ritual, plus strength and humility. Pope Francis tells the faithful how we can learn from 2 saints whose feasts are today. Lawmakers in Malta have approved a measure that would legalize abortion if the mother's life is at risk and after the consent of 3 specialists. The majority Catholic island nation had been one of the few Western countries with a total ban on abortion. A UK appeals court says a government plan to send asylum seekers to Rwanda is, quote, unlawful.
That there is a real risk that persons sent to Rwanda will be returned to their home countries where they faced persecution or other inhumane treatment when in fact they have a good claim for asylum.
In a 2-to-1 ruling, the Lord Chief Justice of England said Rwanda is not a safe country for asylum seekers. The government is expected to challenge the ruling at the UK Supreme Court. Well, France has vowed to restore order after a police officer shot a 17-year-old driver earlier this week. After 2 nights of violence in the Paris suburbs, French officials said that they would deploy 40,000 police officers. They also will take a zero-tolerance approach in neighborhoods where buildings and vehicles were torched. Many are upset at the killing, which was captured on video. Muslim pilgrims have performed the stoning of the devil ritual as part of the Hajj pilgrimage in Saudi Arabia. It is said to be a reenactment of the story of the prophet Abraham, who hurled stones at Satan to resist temptation. If physically and financially able, all Muslims are required to undertake the Hajj pilgrimage at least once in their lives. Well, finally tonight, as we mentioned earlier in the newscast, it is the feast of Saints Peter and Paul, and Pope Francis used the occasion to explain how God can help us even in our weaknesses.
E facciamo qualche domanda a partire dalla roccia, dalla pietra e dal sasso.
In a special address at the Vatican, the Holy Father says St. Peter could be as solid as a rock, yet when he denied our Lord, he was as weak as a pebble. Pope Francis adds that it just shows that Peter and Paul had faults and weaknesses, and even 2 giants of the church have traits which every Christian can identify with. Well, finally tonight, the Feast of Saints Peter and Paul is about more than just their lives. It also honors their martyrdom. EWTN Vatican Bureau Chief Andreas Thonhauser has more.
Every year, on the 29th of June, the city of Rome celebrates its patron saints, St. Peter and St. Paul, a liturgical feast in honor of the martyrdom of the 2 holy apostles, a martyrdom they suffered in 64 when Emperor Nero accused Christians of being responsible for the fire that devastated Rome. The emperor's accusation led to a harsh persecution of Christians. Some of them were clothed in the skins of wild animals and fed to the dogs. Others were crucified or even turned into human torches to be lit after dark. And it was in this terrible scenario that Saints Peter and Paul were condemned to death. St. Paul, who was a Roman citizen, was beheaded. Led in chains under the escort of 3 soldiers, St. Paul was condemned to death at Aquae Salviae, 3 miles from the city of Rome, today the site of the 3 Fountains Abbey. The abbey's name comes from the memory of this 13th apostle. According to an ancient tradition, at the moment of his beheading, St. Paul's head fell to the ground and bounced 3 times, each time giving rise to a spring of water. This is now made visible by 3 small shrines in the Church of St. Paul at the 3 Fountains. The martyrdom suffered by St. Peter was different. According to a well-established tradition, St. Peter did not consider himself worthy to undergo the same death as Christ. Therefore, he had himself crucified upside down. This happened in the vicinity of where St. Peter's Basilica stands today, in the Circus of Caligula. We still have a silent witness of this event, the obelisk that stands in the middle of the square. An obelisk that arrived in Rome from Egypt in the year 40. At the command of Emperor Caligula, it was to be erected in the middle of his circus, which stood to the left of today's St. Peter's Basilica. Only in 1586, under the pontificate of Pope Sixtus V, was this obelisk moved to the center of the square by architect Domenico Fontana. The feast of Saints Peter and Paul, which originated in the first Christian communities in memory of their martyrdom and the veneration of the relics of the 2 apostles, is still solemnly celebrated today. After almost 2,000 years, the city of Rome still pays homage to the saints by laying out carpets of flowers in the small square in front of St. Peter's. In Rome, Andreas Thonhauser and Matteo Cioffi, EWTN News Nightly.
Thank you for watching tonight. Remember, you can follow us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at EWTN News Nightly. I'm Tracy Sable. Good night, and God bless.